Good morning. Welcome to our Bible study. The Apostle Paul said that love is the highest, that it doesn't matter what you do or what you sacrifice. If it's not motivated by love, then it really doesn't matter. Love is the greatest. It's the highest. Though, even if you obey, if it's not done with the right motive, it's really not worthwhile. Our love for God and our love for others. Jesus says that men will know you're my disciples if you love. That's what it's all. If you love each other. And so, love is our motivator. And the way we treat others, the way we talk about others is crucial to our Christianity. And God says He doesn't want us playing God. He doesn't want us doing His job. God's in the judging business. He's the only one that has the right to judge others. And when we judge others, then we are taking God's job. We're playing God. And He flatly forbids us doing that. James gives us some strong direction in this area. He says, brothers, do not slander one another. Now, before we go any further, we need to define that. What is slander? Well, actually, it doesn't have to be untrue. Slander is when you say something negative about another person. Why do we do that? Why do we like to run people down and tell things on people, whether they're true or not, if they're negative? Why do we do that? Isn't that kind of sick? It makes us feel better about ourselves to run down, hey, did you hear that old so-and-so got arrested the other night, or got in trouble, or, that's kind of twisted, really. But it's part of our human nature. Somehow we think if we can point out the faults of others, that it makes us feel superior. And so James says, do not slander one another. Anyone who speaks against his brother or judges him speaks against the law and judges it. When you judge the law, you're not keeping it, but sitting in judgment on it. There is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But you, who are you to judge your neighbor? This is hard for us. Why? Oh, that's one reason I wanted to teach this lesson, because our world today is in such a mean, hateful, judgmental. There's so much on the news, and we hear so much about people saying harsh, mean, angry things about one another. Our government is just eat up with it. Politicians just say horrible things about each other, and it almost makes you not want to listen to the news. There's some nights I just don't, because I'm just not in the mood to be depressed. But James is very, very plain. He says, if you slander your brother, and slander here, like I said, doesn't necessarily mean it's not true. You can say something that's true about somebody, and it be slander. God doesn't want us speaking. Matter of fact, what did Paul say in Corinthians about what kind of things we should, or in Ephesians, what we should say about others? Only things that will build others up. Well, when he says only, what does that do? that gets rid of all the other. He says, just don't go there. We can find things to criticize others for. We can always find some things. he's ugly, or he's mean, or he doesn't do things the way I do. We can always find mean things to say about people. But the Bible says, don't go there. Just don't go there. That's not your job. That's God's job. If they need judging, God will judge them. It's not my place to run other people down, to say negative, mean things about people. But that is so difficult. In Romans, he says, when you, a mere man, pass judgment on them and yet do the same thing, do you think you will escape God's judgment? Is that not the height of hypocrisy? When I criticize somebody else and then I have flaws in my own life? That's... And he's saying, do you think you're going to escape God's judgment when you pass judgment on others and yet you have sins in your life? When they brought the woman to Jesus caught in adultery, what did he tell them? He didn't say, she's not guilty. What did he say? Yeah, you who don't have any sins, you throw the first rock. He says, yeah, she got caught. But if you're qualified to throw rocks at her, go ahead. If you don't have any sins, you go right ahead. You throw the first stone. They all left. So we have to be careful about judging others in any way. And when we say negative, mean things about people, that is judging. We have to understand that. And we don't think of it as judging, but it is. And so we need to be careful about gossip, about slander, about saying negative things about people. The Proverbs puts it this way: gossip is so tasty, how we love to swallow it. Another version says, gossip is like tender morsels. It goes down to the inmost parts. It's like chocolate. We just love. If somebody comes up to you and says, you want to hear some good gossip? What's your reaction? Not what it should be, but what is? What's my natural reaction? Is there anything more exciting than when somebody says, hey, you want to hear some good gossip? Did you hear about Jeff the other night at the theater? No, tell me about it. Did you hear about Keith getting caught the other night driving home from work? My mind immediately goes to all kinds of places. Ooh, what was he doing? Why do we like to share bad things about others? Maybe one thing that makes us feel better about ourselves, which is kind of sick. Why else would we do that?
I guess people think it makes them seem smarter because they know what's going on.
Oh yeah, I know what's going on. Yeah, we like to share things with people. We want people to listen to what we've got to say. And gossip is a great way to get others to listen to you. Now, there are basically two kinds of slander. First of all, there's the exciting to share slander. It's exciting to hear what somebody did bad. Somebody did something terrible, so we want to share that with as many people as possible. And then there's the slander to hurt somebody else. We say something mean about somebody, something they did wrong, or something we think they did wrong, and we just want to hurt them. Again, that's kind of a sick feeling. But sometimes people tell things about others to hurt them, to tear them down, to make them feel bad, or to make others feel bad. Something else, sometimes we try to tear others down so our friends will think less of them. You know, if I'm mad at you, then I go tell everybody what you did so they'll think less of you. And that's kind of sick and twisted. But God says, don't go there. This is not something Christians should be involved in. We don't want to be those folks that hurt others with the words, the things we say. We don't, and no matter what we say it's bad about somebody, it's going to make somebody else think less of them. Is that what we really want? Don't want others to think less of you. Is that why I tell things on you that you have done? You know, why would we want that? And God says, it's not our job to tear each other down. What's our job? To build up, to encourage, to help each other be better people. And slander and gossip and negative things is not going to help build people up. We should be in the people building job, not the people tearing down job, not the criticism. It's not our job to criticize each other and to point out each other's faults. And that's just not where we're supposed to be. God wants us to do the best we can to help one another, to encourage, to build up, not to slander and tear down each other. All right, what are the reasons that we must not judge others? Well, number one, it's just unchristian. Brothers, so do not slander one another, anyone who speaks against his brother. So he's saying that when we do that, it's not Christian. It's not what we are called to do. Why is this hard for us? I keep coming back to that. Why is this hard for us? We all know what it says. Why is it hard? Any thoughts? It goes back to our sinful nature. Yeah. Why else is it hard for us to follow this?
Because sometimes it's the truth, I guess.
Why do we like to tear others down? That's what's sad. Somehow it makes us feel good about ourselves. That's sick. I mean, if I tear you down, then that suddenly makes me feel better about myself, makes me feel superior. That's sad. So it's unchristian for us to slander, to criticize, to gossip about other people. But man, it is so prevalent. It is so easy to do. And we want to listen to it. When we find out somebody's gotten in trouble or somebody's had a problem, we somehow, when somebody's talking about that, we just want to hear it. It's sad. But God says, don't go there. That's not what I'm calling my people to do. We're not in the business of judging each other and criticizing. Secondly, we have the gift of criticism. What does that mean?
We always find something bad.
Oh, yeah. For one thing, it's easy to find things to criticize about others. And we think we have a right to do it. I have the gift of criticism. I can criticize you if I see something amiss in your life. What's the problem with that? As far as God is concerned. I've got things to criticize too. Now, if I don't have anything to criticize, then maybe. But if I've got things in my life that aren't perfect, how dare I criticize something in your life that's not perfect? I'm sure God's up in heaven just shaking his head saying, what are you doing? You're finding fault with this other guy and you have faults? Yeah, God has forgiven us. He says, I'm willing to forgive you and get over it and forget about it and put it in the past. Why don't you do the same? Yeah. And so it's unchristian. It's just not what we are called to be, we're called to do. But somehow we feel like we have the gift of criticism. We have the right to criticize others. And God says, you don't want to go there. That's not what I've called you to do. Slander is of the devil. The Bible talks about the devil slandering good people. Well, if the devil does it, what should that tell me? That's probably not something I want to engage in. And so slander is of the devil. It comes from hell. And so that should not be part of my life. Running people down, criticizing them, pointing out their faults, imagined or real, it doesn't matter. God says that's of the devil. Stay away from it. Secondly, God says it's not loving for us to slander and complain and criticize and point out the faults of others. James 2:8 says, if you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbor as yourself. What does he mean by the royal law? What could that carry with it? The royal law.
Honestly, royalty is the idea here. Is that the way?
No, you're on the right track. Yeah. It's very important. It's the highest. Yeah. Well, what's not royal law? What does that mean? He's saying the other laws that we keep, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not blah, blah, blah. All these hundreds of rules. Those are laws, those are rules, they're good. But there's a royal law. What's the royal law? Love. Jesus said when he was asked, what's the greatest commandment? What did he say? Love God with all your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. And then what did he say? All the other laws hang on those two. In other words, if you love God and you love your neighbor, you won't have any trouble not stealing, not lying. You don't have to have all those rules if you have the royal law. The royal law is love. Love God, love people, and then you don't have to worry about, if we really love each other, we don't steal, we don't lie to each other, we don't cheat each other, is what he's saying. The royal law is the highest form. Love people, and then you won't have to worry about all the rest of it. Everything else hangs on those two. And if I love you, I'm not going to run around telling people about bad things. If your kid brought home straight F's on his report card, would you get on the phone and call everybody and say, let me tell you how stupid my kid is? Why wouldn't you do that? Why don't you get, if your kids mess up, say if they got brought home by a cop last night, got in trouble, do you get on the phone and call everybody you know and tell them your child got arrested last night? No, why? Out of love. If you love your child, you don't want to call everybody up and tell how terrible they are. Well, why would we do that to each other? If we love people, we don't gossip and we don't tell people about all the bad things you've done. If I find out you got arrested 10 years ago, I don't need to go around telling everybody that. That's not going to help you. It's not going to help me. It's not going to help anybody else. But somehow we feel compelled if we find out something bad about somebody, we got to tell about it. Well, God says that's not love. I shouldn't think about telling bad things about you. That's not going to... Now, when's the only time your behavior needs to be brought up? If I can help you. If I find out you've been doing something that's wrong, I need to go to you in private and say, brother, I love you. This might not be good for you. I urge you to stop it. But what's good's it going to do for me to go to everybody else and tell them what you've done? It's not going to help you. And that's what he's saying. I should love you enough to want to help you, but I don't hate you enough to go running around blabbing about everything you've done. We've all got things I suspect we've done that we're not proud of. And we don't need to have somebody go around telling everybody what a terrible thing we did. True or not true, it doesn't matter. God says just don't go there. That's not loving. Then he says, not only is it not loving, it's not righteous to do this. Why? Because there's only one lawgiver and one judge. Who is that? That's God. He says, that's not your job. You just stay away from that. We don't need to go out here and judging others. We don't need to tell everybody else how terrible someone is. That's God's job. It's not my job to go out here and blab everything that I know about you. He says it's just not righteous when we do that sort of thing. When is it wrong to judge? Now, the Bible does say, make right judgments. So there is a time for judging. So when is it wrong to judge? Well, first of all, he says it's wrong to judge when I have the same sin. Who are we usually the hardest on? Folks that do the same thing we do. It's amazing. In Romans, he says, you therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. So when you, a mere man, pass judgment on them and yet do the same thing, do you think you'll escape God's judgment? Now, he was talking to the Jews in chapter 2. In chapter 1, he's talking to the Gentiles. In chapter 2, he turns to the Jews. Now, in chapter 1, he talks about all the terrible things the Gentiles were doing. What do you suppose the Jews were thinking at that point? Yeah, brother, preach it. Tell them Gentiles how evil they are. But then Paul turned to the Jews and says, you are no better than the Gentiles. Yes, the Gentiles have done a lot of bad things, but so do you. You guys have been unfaithful to God. You've worshiped false gods. You commit adultery. You lie. You steal. You cheat. How dare you sit in judgment on the Gentile world? You're worse than they are because you had the law. You had the truth. You had the prophets. The Gentiles didn't have any of that. You had it all, and yet you continue to sin as well. How dare you sit in judgment on them? And so when I have sin in my life, how dare I point out the sins in your life? God says, man, talk about hypocrisy. Talk about walking on the edge. In the first place, it's my job to judge, not yours. But when you do judge, you better not have the same sin. You better not have sin in your life. You're going to point out the sins in others. One of the problems is, what am I willing to do with my sins? I'm willing to overlook my sins. Yeah, now I may get angry about your sins, but when I've got sins, I'm kind of willing to, well, that's just mistakes. That's not really sins, you know. That's just weakness. And so sometimes we're blinded to our own faults. The worst lying we do is to ourselves. In Matthew, he says, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own? Yeah, that's pretty bad. When we point out other people's sins and we have sins just as bad or worse in our own lives, he says that's bad. That's judging way beyond what God has given me the authority to judge. Sometimes we draw conclusions based on outward appearances. Now, if you were driving down the road and you saw a brother go into a bar, what could you think? He's going there to get liquored up. And I could go out and tell everybody, boy, I saw brother so-and-so going into a bar last night. Obviously, he was drinking. Well, what could he be going in for? He could be going in to talk to somebody. He could be going in to help another brother out, to take him out of the bar. There could be a dozen good reasons for him going into a bar. Yeah, he might be asking directions. Who knows? Yeah. Maybe the bar owner owes him some money. Who knows? Or maybe he's got him, But when we just jump to conclusions without knowing the facts, that's a wrong judgment. You have a thought? Oh. John says, stop judging by mere appearances. Make a right judgment. If you see somebody walking down the street and their clothes are all torn and they're dirty, what might you assume? Ma'am? Yeah, he's homeless, he's a bum, he's out of work. But what might be the case? Maybe he's had a hard day at work. Maybe he got beat up. Maybe he was in a car wreck. You know, and God says, before you jump to conclusions about people, check the facts. When I was a school teacher, I found out that sometimes judgments we make about kids were unjust. You know, if a child is difficult in school, we assume he's a bad kid. But what might be the problem? Maybe his home life is horrible. Maybe he goes home and his drunk father comes home and beats him up, and his mother runs out on him all night, and he doesn't get breakfast. You know, he has to feed himself and clothe himself. He might be doing well to come to school, but we just assume he's a bad kid because he's not acting like he's supposed to. Well, it may not be him, it might be something else. And so the Bible says, don't judge by appearances. Don't jump to conclusions. There might be something behind it you don't know about. Find out the facts before you make judgments about people.
Well, we don't like that.
Sir?
We don't like that today.
Oh, no.
We look at something, we make a judgment like that, and we're stuck in our camp.
Uh-huh.
That person's guilty.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
No matter what facts come out.
Oh, yeah. 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 You can be judged today for anything. Just the car you drive, where you live, the color of your face. I mean, we judge all kinds of things. When Samuel was sent to crown the king of Israel, he went to the house of David. David had brothers. And when David was the youngest of the family, and when the prophet walked into the house and the oldest son walked in, what was Samuel's response? Oh, this guy's tall and good looking, and this must be the next king of Israel. And what did God say? He says, I don't judge people by their outward appearance. This is not the one. I'm judging by their heart. And finally, he went through all the boys, and none of them worked. He says, do you have another son? Well, yeah, I got this. My youngest son's out in the field with the sheep. We'll bring him in. And that's the one God selected. But Samuel would have never selected him as the king. God says, I don't look at the outward, I look at the inward. He knew David's the one that had the right heart for the job. And so we have to realize we can't judge people by their outward appearance.
In life, it's pretty accepted that, in normal life, as jobs or any job that we do, just by using your own little mind, you don't know how well you're doing the job unless you have feedback.
Right.
You have something that's coming from others saying what you're doing is good or you're doing needs to be changed or whatever. If you don't have that feedback just from your own mind, it's probably going to be not right.
Oh, yeah.
Messed up. And so, what's the best feedback? The guidance that we get is because people could be in error, but God's word is not
Right.
in error. So,
I am told that years ago when Sam Walton owned Walmart before he passed away, that he drove around an old beat-up pickup truck, he wore overalls, and he had an old dog with him. Now, if you saw that guy on the street, what would you think? This is some old poor farmer out here in Arkansas. The guy was the richest man on the planet. I mean, he was worth billions of dollars. But boy, you'd never know that by looking at him. And so we have to be careful judging people's looks and judging their character by how their outward appearance. And so God says, that's not our job. And when you do, before you decide about people, you need to check out the facts. You need to find out what's really going on. Sometimes we make judgments before we hear the facts. In John, he says, does our law condemn anyone without first hearing him to find out what he's doing? You know, sometimes we see a person and we leap to a judgment. There's a court case recently in this country where this black kid was running down the street, and what these guys do? What'd they think? Yeah, he must be stealing. Of course, he didn't have anything in his hands. Obviously, he hadn't stolen. But they said, well, he must be a thief. So they pulled him over and shot him, killed him. And then they were convicted of murder, which they should have been. They just leapt to a conclusion because this kid was running down the street and they didn't know the facts. They didn't try to find out the facts. They just leapt to a conclusion. This guy's a criminal. Well, he wasn't. And so God says, don't do that. Find out what's really going on. Have you ever been accused of something that you didn't do because somebody didn't know the facts? Sure, we all been guilty of that. We all have been the victims of that. And we certainly don't want to be the perpetrators of that. God says, find out the facts before you come to conclusions. I've been on 3 different juries in my life. And in every case, when the trial started, I had one opinion, but by the time it was ended, I had a different one. Because once I found out the facts, things change. And God says, find out the facts. When I judge based on differences of opinion or practice, that's wrong. Therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat, drink, or regard to religious festivals, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are shadows of the things to come. Now, what he's talking about in this passage is the Jews had the old law of Moses. And after Christ came, many of the Jews held on to the Jewish practices. And when Paul would go around to planting churches all over the empire, particularly Gentile churches, he didn't teach them all these rules. The Jews had to observe 3 festivals every year. They had to eat certain foods. They had to dress certain ways. They had all kinds of rules that they kept. Paul never asked the Gentiles to keep those rules. Paul says you don't have to keep those. Those are Jewish rules. But some of the Jewish teachers came in after Paul had left, and they would say, okay, it's all right for you to be a Christian, but you also have to keep all these rules. You have to be circumcised. You have to keep these days of festivals. You have to eat this kind of food. And Paul says, no, don't let them judge you based on those old rules. Well, sometimes we have rules. We have things we think people should do. And we have to be careful not to bind those things on others, because those are opinions. They're not Scripture. We can't bind our opinions on people. There's a lot of things I think people should do, but that doesn't mean they have to. So we need to be careful about binding our opinions and our practices and our traditions on someone else. The first preaching job I ever had was in Tennessee. And every elders meeting that I went to, every service, I even had to wear a suit and tie to work. I mean, that was just what everybody did. And one day, one of the brethren saw me without a tie on. He got all bent out of shape. Because he wore a tie wherever he went. He was a businessman. And he thought no self-respecting, decent man would go out in public without a tie on. Well, where I came from, we didn't wear ties all the time. My son in Georgia doesn't even wear a suit and tie to preach in every Sunday. But that's just, and some people will judge you if you don't wear a tie because that's human tradition. That's not necessarily what God thinks is best. When it causes me to speak evil about another Christian, that's reasons we should not judge others. As Paul said, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouth, but only, boy, if we could just remember this one passage, it would cure a lot of ill. Only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. Boy, this is so tough. If everything we said about one another, if we would first say, okay, is this going to build him up? That would solve a lot of this issue. But that's hard for us to do. It's just not our nature. And when I judge a person's heart or their motives, what's the problem with that? I don't know their heart. I don't know their motives. Sometimes we assume a person's motives because we think, well, that's what my motivation would be. Paul says, he will bring to light what is hidden in darkness and will expose the motives of men's hearts. What does that imply? That God has to make the judgment. Yeah, I can't judge your motive. I can't know what's your heart. And when I attribute motives to you, and I don't know what they are, I am really, really taking a risk. All right, how do we break the habit of judging others? Well, number one, we need to remember, I will be judged by the same standard I use to judge others. Wow, that's scary. Jesus says, do not judge or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the same measure you use, it will be measured to you. Ouch. What's he saying? It's serious. Yeah, it's very serious. When I start saying things about you, God says, careful, I'm going to use the same standard on you that you're using on him. So I better make sure I'm right. This is one scary passage. Remember that each of us must give an account of ourselves. Who all do we give an account for? Ourselves. I can't answer for anybody else. I have to answer for myself. So then, each of us will give an account of himself to God. Therefore, let us stop passing judgment on one another. Why? Again, it's God's job. And I am playing God when I start passing judgment on my brother. When I start running him down, criticizing him, I am judging. I'm doing God's job. And God says, listen, you're going to have enough to answer by yourself. You don't need to start judging other people. And maybe the best motive of all for not judging others, remember, God's been merciful to me. James says, mercy triumphs over judgment. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. What did he say about is going to happen to me if I judge you? He'll judge me the same way. If I am merciful to you, what happens? He's merciful to me. So, this is hard for us. It's part of our culture. It's part of our lives. It's part of our nature. But God said, this is a serious matter. Just leave the judging up to me. You do the best you can to help people, to encourage them, to build them up, and let me worry about the wrong. All right, thank you for being with us today. See you next time. Why in the world did God make us like we are? Why did He make us where we can sin? Why did He make us like puppets where we have no choice but to do the right thing? Well, there's a reason for that. You see, God wanted us to be family. He doesn't want a race of automatons, a race of robots, a race of puppets. God wants us to choose to love Him, to worship Him, to serve Him. What would happen if I went home to my wife and says, well, I have a marriage license here that says you have to love me. We stood before a preacher and he told you, you had to love me, whether you want to or not. Well, that's not going to work. And so God created us with free will because we have to choose. We have to choose whether or not we're going to serve Him or ourselves. In this life, we all have to make choices. All of us do. No one else can choose for you. You have to make the choices yourself. You have to choose whether or not you're going to serve God. I wish I could have done that with my children. I wish I could have chosen for them, but I couldn't. They had to ultimately choose whether they were going to serve God or not. We all come to forks in the road, and we have to choose. Which way are we going to go? Now, one of the things that makes these choices difficult is that the Bible does not always specifically address the situation that we find ourselves in. Sometimes you need to make a choice, but you don't know exactly what God says is the way to go. Now, this problem comes up because the Bible is not meant to be a rule book. God didn't just give us a list of rules. Now, in the Old Covenant, they had a list of 614. That's just phenomenal to me. There were 614 separate rules under the Old Covenant the Jews had to follow. Wouldn't you like to have to learn all those? But the New Testament is not a rule book. It's a book of principles. It's a book of general guidelines. God never intended to legislate on every conceivable situation that could occur. If He had, the Library of Congress would not contain the entire Bible. God gives us guidelines that guide us into right decisions, that tell us how we should live. This morning, I want us to look at 6 questions we need to ask ourselves whenever we're faced with choices. 6 things that a Christian should stop and say, okay, this is what I need to ask myself when I'm making a choice. These questions will help us to discern what God wants me to do. The first and most important question we need to ask ourselves when we're faced with decisions of life is, will this choice help me fulfill my goal? Today we're going to be primarily in 1 Corinthians. Paul is dealing with a unique problem that the Corinthians had. The poor Corinthians. Normally when Paul went to a new town, he would first go to the Jews because they already knew about God. He would convert them to Christianity and then bring the Gentiles in. But Corinth didn't have very many Jews, and so he had to just go right directly to the Gentiles. Well, they had very little background with God. Mostly they had worshipped all kinds of false gods and all kinds of weird stuff. And so after Paul had left, the church developed all these problems. I mean, they just got everything confused. So Paul actually wrote 4 books. We have 2 of them, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, but there are actually 4 letters that Paul wrote to Corinth, helping straighten them out. Well, the Corinthians got all kinds of weird ideas. And so Paul is writing to them, dealing with this issue about making correct decisions. And the Corinthians had developed this really weird idea. When you read this text, you think, what in the world is he talking about? In 1 Corinthians 6:12, he's quoting the Corinthians. They said, I have the right to do anything you say. But not everything's beneficial. Paul says, yes, in Christ you have a freedom that nobody else has. As Christians, we are free. We can choose to do basically what we want. But we need to ask ourselves, is this a beneficial thing? Is this something I should do? Is this going to be a good thing? Don't just make a choice, but ask yourself, is this good? Not everything is beneficial. What does that word mean? Well, beneficial means, is it moving you in a positive direction? Is it good for you? Is it something you want to do? Now, this is the most important thing I'm going to say today. As a Christian, you have to have a goal. And your goal has to be eternity with God. Paul says, what will a man give in exchange for his soul? If a man were to gain the entire world and yet lose his soul, what's he gain? In other words, it doesn't matter. If your goal is not to get to heaven, if your goal is not to be right with God on the day of judgment, then you've got no goal. Everything's worthless. That's the ultimate goal. And so you and I have a goal. We're going somewhere. We have a point in existing. We're going to heaven. And so when Paul says not everything's beneficial, what he's saying is, yes, you have the right to make a choice. But is that going to help you toward your goal? When you and I make choices in life, whether it's what college degree to get, who to marry, where to live, what jobs to have, whatever, we must keep in mind, is this choice going to help me toward my goal of heaven? You know, if I were offered a job in Nova Scotia making $4 million a year, but that's not going to help me get to heaven, then I should turn that down. If that's going to decrease my chance of getting to heaven, I should turn that down without a thought. Because getting to heaven is really all that matters. And so the first question I need to ask myself when I'm faced with a decision is this going to help me get to my goal of being right with God? We have a purpose. In Romans 8, Paul says we are predestined for a purpose, to be conformed to the image of Jesus Christ. That is my main goal, to be like Christ. That's to be my goal. I want to be like Him. And so we need to ask ourselves, will this choice help me be a Christian? I heard of a man out west several years ago who came to a certain town. And as he walked into this small town, he noticed that on every fence post and every barn door and in every tree, there were circles, a target, with an arrow stuck right in the middle of every target. And he thought, man, there must be a fabulous archer in this town. He has hit every single target dead center. And there were dozens of them. This guy never misses. So when he went into town, he started asking, where is this fabulous archer that stuck all these arrows out here in these targets? And then the people would laugh and they say, oh, well, that's old Sam. He's the town character. He's kind of simple-minded. So eventually found Sam. He says, how did you manage to hit all these targets in the middle? And Sam says, well, I just shoot arrows, and wherever they hit, I go draw the circles around them. I guarantee you, if you don't aim at a target, you're not probably going to hit it. You and I have to focus on the target. The target is heaven. Am I right with God? That's all that matters. God's been very specific about that. Eternity is what matters. Even if it costs you your life, it's worth it to go to heaven. So each of us, whenever we're faced with a decision, the first thing I need to ask myself is this going to help me get to heaven? Is this going to help me in my spiritual life? You know, there's nothing wrong with a 100-pound barbell. Matter of fact, they can be good. But if you're running a race, you probably don't want to carry it with you. It's not sinful. It just won't help you get to your goal. Everything is permissible, says Paul. A Christian can do anything he wants. But he's got to ask himself, is it beneficial? Is it useful in his life? Decisions need to be made in light of what will help us reach our goal. I had an elder friend in Tennessee, the first church I ever worked for. And he worked for the state. He was a very important, knowledgeable man. He also owned a very large farm, raised cattle, raised several crops, hay and so forth. Hard-working farm, hard-working family. But he also raised tobacco. East Tennessee and Virginia has some of the best soil in the world for raising tobacco. And the government strictly regulates how much land you can put into tobacco production to keep the prices up. And so every farmer has to qualify for his tobacco allotment. And you're given so many acres you can raise tobacco on, and that's it. But you can buy other people's allotments. Well, this guy realized that tobacco was a much higher grossing product than anything else he was raising. He could make more money raising tobacco than cows or anything else. So he bought up several other guys' allotments so he could raise a lot of tobacco, and he's making a lot of money raising tobacco. But after he became an elder and he started thinking about it, he came to me one day and said, "Steve, do you think I should be raising tobacco?" He says, "I know it's a dangerous product and it kills a lot of people." And he said, "I'm just not real comfortable raising tobacco." And I says, "Well, what do you think?" He says, "I don't think I should be raising tobacco." And he quit. And I thought, that was a man who made a decision based on what his goal was. I mean, he sacrificed a lot to give up that, but he thought this is the right thing to do. And so he made that choice based on what's best for my relationship with God. And I admired that so much because it's hard to give up thousands of dollars of income like that. The second question we need to ask ourselves when we're making an important decision in life is, will this choice control me? In verse 12, he says, he's quoting the Corinthians, "I have the right to do anything." But Paul says, "But I will not be mastered by anything." Paul says, yes, you can do whatever you want. As a Christian, you're free. But you have to ask yourself, is this going to control my life? Is this going to take over? Sometimes we make decisions and then we realize later, this thing owns me. I don't own it. You know, sometimes people get involved in businesses or in hobbies or drugs or alcohol or friends, and it just kind of takes over. And Paul says you don't want anything in your life that takes you over, that runs you, that takes over control of your life. Paul says, I'm not going to be a slave about anything. I read a story about a soldier in a war who sent a word to his commanding officer, "I've taken a prisoner." The commander says, "Wonderful, bring him with you." The soldier sent back a message, "He won't come." And the officer says, "Well, leave him and come on." The soldier said, "He won't let me." Well, who captured who is the question. Who owns who? There's a lot of Christians who, when you look at their lives, they're enslaved to something. They've been taken over. One of the ways you can know if a thing is good or bad for you is, does it own you? Has it taken your life over? Is this habit forming? Something I can't get rid of? We can be addicted to lust, social drinking, drugs, nicotine, caffeine, soap operas, rock music, money-making schemes. First, it's virtually limitless. But we must make sure when we decide something, is this going to take my life over? Is it going to own me? Anything you cannot walk away from owns you. And that makes it wrong for us. As a Christian, we don't have the right to fool around with things that will keep Jesus from being the center of our lives. I spent the first 7 years of my life in Shreveport, Louisiana. My father worked for a gas company in Shreveport, and then we moved to Arkansas. But that first 7 years, we got to know several people on our street pretty close. They were friends of my father's and my mother's. Well, years later, when I was a teenager, we went back to visit, and we visited 3 of those families that had lived on our street. All 3 of them had become great successes. They had made a lot of money, and they lived in big homes, and we visited all 3 of the homes. And in every case, all 3 cases, I thought it was interesting. The men had been taken over by other things. The wives were all very unhappy because when they lived on that simple street making average money, the family was together. But now the men were so busy doing other things. One of them was so involved in the oil business that he never was home. Another guy had gotten involved in a hobby that he was gone all the time. All 3 of them had been taken over by something. And the wives were very unhappy. Their families were not happy, even though they had big houses and everything was great. So be careful, something that you get into doesn't own you. Question number 3 that we need to ask ourselves, what will this choice do to my influence? We all have influence over others. We all do. Whether you realize it or not, you influence other people around you. In this particular culture, in the pagan city of Corinth, there were many temples to false gods. Corinth had more temples per square mile than any other city in the world. Corinth was the Las Vegas of the day, or maybe more accurately today, the San Francisco of the day. But Corinth it had a temple on every corner to all the gods. Well, the way you worshipped most of the false gods, now the way you worshipped the god of wine was to get drunk, but the way you worshipped most of the other gods was just like the Jews worship Jehovah. You take an animal to the temple and it would be sacrificed. But in most cases, when the animal was sacrificed, they just took the blood. And then you've got this meat. They would drain the blood out of the meat, but you still have a cow or a lamb, and you still have good meat. And so they would normally take the meat down into the marketplace, the agora, as they called them in Greece, and they would sell the meat in the market. Well, a lot of the Christians, after they had been converted to Christ, began to wonder, can we eat that meat? Since that meat was offered to a false god, would it be all right for us to eat it? And then some of the other Christians were saying, it's just meat. Yeah, it was offered to a false god, but they brought the meat down here. Now it's for sale. It doesn't matter. It's fine. And so they had a big problem with this. And some of the Christians were saying, no, you can't eat that meat. That's sinful. If you ate that meat, you'd be worshiping a false god. Other Christians say, I can eat that meat all day. It won't bother me. That's what Paul said. He said, meat's meat. It doesn't matter. But he then says, be careful of your influence. Paul said, even though you can eat it and it won't bother your conscience, if it bothers your brother's conscience, think about that. If it causes him to sin, you don't want to do it. Paul says, food does not bring us close to God. He says, whether you eat it or not, God doesn't care. If you eat steak, fine. If you eat beans, that's fine. It doesn't matter to God. Food's food. God gave it all. We're no worse if we do not eat. We're no better if we do. But be careful, however, that the exercise of your freedom does not become a stumbling block to the weak. He says, if you got a brother in church that doesn't feel like it's right to eat that meat, then when you invite him over to your house, don't put a steak in front of him coming from one of these pagan temples. Don't encourage him to do something that might be wrong for him. Love him enough not to put temptation in his way. Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother to fall into sin, I'll never eat meat again. Paul says, my brother is more important to me than my freedom to eat steak. So I will not cause him to fall. Paul also gave us this principle in chapter 8. He says, be careful, however, that the exercise of your freedom does not become a stumbling block to the weak. Paul's not talking about the case where somebody comes up to you and says, well, what you're doing offends me. What folks like that often say is, I don't like what you're doing. Don't do it. Paul is saying, if what you're doing could cause your brother to lose his faith or to sin, don't do it. We need to stop and ask ourselves, is what I'm doing good for my brother? Suppose a fellow says, well, I don't see anything wrong with it. I'm going to go down and buy me a big, thick, juicy steak and eat every last bite of it. Paul says, now about food sacrificed to idols. We know that we all possess knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. He says, just because you know that eating steak from an animal that had been offered to an idol, just because you know that it doesn't make any difference, God doesn't care if you want to eat it. But don't use your knowledge to feel superior to a brother who doesn't understand that. If he feels bad about it, don't do it. Love your brother enough not to put temptation in his way. Just because you decide something is all right doesn't mean you should challenge your brother's faith. What we do has an influence on others. There might be something you do that you don't feel is wrong at all, but some other Christian might feel that's bad. And be aware of what you do, say, think affects other people, is what Paul's saying. We cannot escape our influence. Some of you may remember years ago there was a very well-known TV preacher by the name of Jimmy Swaggart. He was on TV for years, had a huge audience, and he got involved with a prostitute. Well, when that happened and it came out, the money that was contributed to the denomination that he was part of, I mean, we're talking about hundreds of churches across the country, actually lost 25% of their income. He had such an influence in that church that his fall caused a 25% decrease in contributions to that church. So whether you want to admit it or not, we all have influence. And so God says, when you make a choice, think about, how is this going to influence my family, my Christian friends, my neighbors? When they see me do this, is this going to have a detrimental effect? The next question I need to ask myself, will this choice lead to holiness? Again, Paul says, I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is constructive. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others. It's what I'm doing, is the decision I'm going to make, helping other people to be more holy, helping me to be more holy. Every word, every activity, every friendship, every movie that we go to, we must think about, is this going to help me become more holy in life? Not all forms of recreation are going to help us be a better person. Not all forms of entertainment are going to help us maintain our godliness, and we need to think about that. Not all of our friendships are going to help us be better Christians. Sometimes people are bad influences on us, and we need to think about that. Will this decision make me more holy? The fifth question we need to ask ourselves, will this choice glorify God? Will the choice I'm about to make be glorifying to God? Notice what Paul said. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. That would be a great thing to keep in mind. Is this choice I'm making going to be for God's glory, or is it going to be for mine? Is it going to make me better off, or is it going to help my relationship with God? Does what I'm about to do exalt Jesus? Does it demonstrate that Jesus is the Lord of my life? You see, if you're a Christian, if you call yourself a Christian, you are wearing His name. And everything we do as Christians is going to show out to people who aren't. Unfortunately, as a preacher, I have talked to a lot of non-Christians over the year who have said, well, I know so-and-so and he's a Christian. And if that's Christianity, I don't want any part of it. That's terrible. That's why Jesus says, I'd rather you be cold than lukewarm. Because the lukewarm ones are the ones that people look at and say, well, I'm as good a Christian as he is. Jesus said, I'd rather you just deny me than be lukewarm. Because if you deny me, nobody's going to take you as a Christian. But if you say, yeah, I'm a Christian, but I don't live like it. I remember when I was a kid, we had a new preacher come to town at my school. His daughter came to our school. He wasn't our preacher, but she quickly let it be known in the whole school. She says, well, I'm a preacher's kid, but I don't act like it. Boy, she didn't. She hated being a preacher's kid because she felt like that was a damper on her behavior. Well, can you imagine what kind of influence that was to her father? How proud he would have been of that. Whatever you do, make it right. Paul says, you are bought at a price, therefore honor God with your body. Whatever you do, make sure you remember you're honoring God. Finally, will this choice make it more difficult to share my faith? One of our jobs in this world is to share our faith with others, to tell others about Jesus Christ, to show them the way to Christ. But if we don't act like Christians, people are going to look at us and they're going to say, why would I want that? Paul said, do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews or Greeks or the church of God, even as I try to please everybody in every way. Paul says, I have to share my faith. And if I don't live like it, how in the world am I going to share that with other people? How in the world can I be a Christian? I certainly don't want to do anything. And, you know, I've studied with a lot of people over the years, a lot of non-Christians. Some of them I managed to convert to Christ. Some of them I didn't. But the one thing I always prayed was, God, don't allow me to shut the door so somebody else can't teach them. At least let me leave a good image in their minds so they won't be turned off from Christ forever. A Christian should live so that his life would be a good example, so others would want Christ. God has given us free choice. God has given us the right to make decisions. He says, make wise ones. Make good choices. Your life is the sum total of your choices. The most important choice we have to make is whether or not we become Christians. There is no more important choice than, am I going to be a Christian? You can be a Christian. It's a choice. I want to be a Christian. I want to serve the Lord. I want to be saved. If you haven't made that choice, you can today. The baptistry is ready. Everything is prepared. You can become a Christian this morning. You can confess the name of Christ and be baptized into Him. Or if we can help you in any other way, pray with you, we'll be happy to do that. It's the Lord's invitation. Make the right choice. Would you come as we stand and sing?